Fitchburg is a medium-sized city here in central Massachusetts. About 40,000 people call it home. It's not that old, it's not that new, but still, we have quite a history. The land here, the river here, the people who live here is what makes Fitchburg what it is. These things have changed over the years, and that's affected what we have become now. There's questions we can ask about why Fitchburg is what it is today. Why aren't we more agricultural? Or why don't we have a stronger retail economy like surrounding communities do? Over the course of this series, we'll be taking a look at Fitchburg and what has made it what it is. We'll be peeking in a few corners and looking in a few doors to find out what has made us the community we are today. We're going to be taking a look at what happened before Fitchburg was Fitchburg. Common advice is to begin at the beginning, so here we are. Before Europeans arrived, Native Americans used the area around Fitchburg, the Nashua River, the hills, the woods, as part of their yearly living. We don't see too much evidence of that now. I firmly believed as a child that I had found an arrowhead at Coggeshall, but now think it might have been made by my babysitter's brothers. And the Indian table there, surely that was used by Indians, even though the cement footings would kind of say no. All we have left now are a few stone shards for making tools, located by an intermittent brook somewhere in Fitchburg, but they won't tell us where. It's a secret. Archaeologists look at the land, they look at the few remains we have, and they try and recreate the culture. What was this area like before the Europeans and their written language arrived? Archaeologists such as Dr. Mike Volmar, curator at the Fruitlands Museum in Harvard, try different things. One thing that Dr. Volmar has done is to build a bow and a spear throwing device called an addle-addle to see how these things worked and what they could have hunted with them. Dr. Volmar is standing in front of a partially constructed longhouse. Jeff Kalin of Primitive Technologies is building the longhouse for the museum. He uses materials and technologies that would have been in use by the locals before the arrival of the Europeans. The materials are chosen for their utility. The upright cedar posts are resistant to rot. The hardwood horizontals are strong. Kalin has spent quite a bit of time gathering the materials for this building. This winter, he'll be looking for thatching materials in the wetlands. He built his axe from a piece of stone and wood found in the local area. His plumb bob he made from a couple of rocks he found right near the building site. If you look closely at the edges of the poles, you will see that they kind of look chewed, almost like a beaver did this. And what has to happen is that wide axe head, Kalin chops at the tree until it's thin enough to be snapped off, much like a beaver would do when constructing his lodge.
As an archaeologist studying material culture, we can learn a lot about the past people here in the Fitchburg area. Native Americans around here have left a lot of different kinds of artifacts for us to examine, but the acidic soils in the area don't preserve things made out of bone or wood or skins. So any really perishable material hasn't survived, and what we have primarily are stone tools, pottery, and soil features.
People have lived in what is the Nashua River Valley for about 10,000 years. As the landscape changed, the water retreated from a huge glacial lake that extended from southern Massachusetts up into Nashua, New Hampshire. And as the climate changed, people moved in and out, and the lifeways of the people who lived here changed to accommodate that.
Native Americans lived here for about 10,000 years, and over that time they had an intimate knowledge of the environment and sought predictable resources that they could depend on to survive.
The last group of people to live in the Nashua River Valley area were the Eastern Woodland Indians. They lived in this region for about 2,000 to 3,000 years until the Europeans arrived. Everything they ate or they used, they provided for themselves.
They ate a lot of plants. They ate almost every animal we can think of.
Over the course of a year, they would move from area to area because they knew where to find the resources they needed. Many of these resources were seasonal, such as fish runs or the ripening of food and berries. But the Native Americans also took steps to ensure that the resources they needed would be available to them in the future.
Native Americans managed the land to a certain extent, not in ways that we would really even think of today. One of the things that they did is controlled burns. They would burn areas of the forest, and this promoted a massed forest. A massed forest is a nut-bearing tree. So pine trees, they have roots that spread along the top of the ground. Oak trees, for example, have a long root that goes deep into the ground, so the fire will kill the root systems of pine trees faster than it will oak trees. So that promotes acorns. Also hickory, chestnut, nut-bearing trees that Native Americans would gather and store over the winter. Occasionally burning areas of forest, they were clearing the undergrowth, promoting nut-bearing trees, and also creating a better food crop for the animals that they ate as well.
The natives living inland in New England, such as the Indians around the Nashua River Valley, were very dependent on the fresh waters of the area.
Well, Native Americans around Fitchburg definitely used the river. They would have had canoes to use on the river and on the ponds. And at the time of contact anyways, they were known as Nipmuc people, people of fresh water. That doesn't mean that they stayed in this geographic area their whole lives. They may have wandered as far as they wanted to, basically either walking or taking watercraft. They would speak a language that was mutually intelligible with any other group that lived in southern New England. They were probably related to a bunch of those groups through different social events, seasonal rounds. A lot of people met in the Turners Falls area for an annual fish run, for example. And there were probably fish runs on the rivers in Fitchburg as well that they would have known about and anticipated and planned around, and probably had festivals or gatherings, and celebrations when those runs happened.
One of the few religious images we have in the New England area are the petroglyphs, which are on the riverbed of the Connecticut River, visible from Bellows Falls, Vermont. They're carved on river stone. Archaeologists estimate that these figures are perhaps 2,000 years old.
Natives had lots of beliefs. They basically practiced a form of animism, related the spiritual powers to natural forces, air and water. And there certainly were Native Americans around here when settlers arrived, and whether or not they were encamped in Fitchburg and recognized as there by the settlers is a totally different question. There certainly were people living in the area. They might not have been as many people as maybe even 50 years before, and part of that is due to disease that was brought by Europeans. Somewhere probably between 90-95% of the Native Americans who lived in this area died through smallpox, things like that came over from Europe, diseases that they didn't have any natural resistance to. Plymouth Plantation, that area, actually was basically a village that had been completely wiped out. So that's why it was available to the Plymouth colonists to settle on, because the people who had lived there just a few years before had all died. And there's accounts actually of them describing walking in and seeing, just skeletons.
Although the area around Fitchburg was not settled by European settlers until after 1700, historian Stephen F. Johnson, a teacher at Marlborough High School in Massachusetts, tells us about the first encounters.
That probably occurred as early as the 1630s and 40s. You have Concord being settled in that period of the 1630s, and then shortly thereafter in the 1650s you have Groton and Lancaster being established. So we can assume that there were traders, there were settlers making contact with the tribes in the Nashua River Valley as early as the 1640s probably.
European diseases affected the tribes of North America. European wars did just as much harm.
An important chapter in the history of the Nashua, and a tragic chapter, is King Philip's War. When King Philip's War broke out in 1675, It involved the Wampanoag Nation in southeastern Massachusetts. It eventually involved the Narragansett and the Nipmuc, and they were pitted primarily against Massachusetts Bay Colony, Plymouth Colony, and Connecticut. And how the Nashua got involved in that conflict is that the Pennacook Confederacy that was centered over in Lowell and was led by Wanna-Lancet made a decision that they were going to remain neutral in the conflict and withdraw. But the Nashua and some of the other Nipmuc tribes joined the conflict. And so the Nashua are allied with Philip during the conflict. And of course, when the war is over in 1676, and Philip had lost the conflict, many of the Nashua fled from the Nashua River Valley, and they took refuge among the tribes in coastal New Hampshire. And eventually, when the English discovered that, they apprehended many of the Nashua, brought them down to Boston. A number of the Nashua Sagamore were hung in Boston, and large numbers of the Nashua were sold into slavery. So pretty much the tribe was exterminated by the end of King Philip's War. Those that attempted to come back into the land found it occupied, and many of them either moved west or were destroyed during the conflict.
A later war led to events which gave Fitchburg its name.
During King George's War in the 1740s, the French sent war parties of Native Americans south into the New England frontier. And of course, in those days, Lunenburg, Lancaster, and other communities, Groton, were on the edge of that frontier. And so what happens is that John Fitch is in his garrison in what was then part of Lunenburg, and about 80 warriors descended on the garrison. 2 of the defenders were killed, and eventually the defenders in the garrison surrendered. And they were taken captive, and the plan was to take them north, and then the English would have to ransom them to get them back. And as they were making the trek north, the Fitch family left notes on a tree telling the pursuers that came from Lancaster and Groton and Lunenburg not to pursue them because the Indians had promised them their lives if they weren't pursued. So the townspeople let off the pursuit, and they were taken north to Canada. And several years later, I think it was a family of 7 were released, but Mrs. Fitch, overwhelmed by the trek back home, succumbed to it. Anybody that travels around New England and is aware of Native American words is well aware, whether you're in Maine, in New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, Vermont, it really doesn't matter. We see many, many Native American names to mountains, to rivers, to lakes, and this is a testimony to just the widespread presence of Native Americans in the New England region, and the fact that they used every part of the landscape, that so many of these names have survived down to the present day. Mohawk is an interesting name because the Mohawk people don't refer to themselves as the Mohawk in their own native language. They were known as the Kanienga, which meant the people of the Black Flint. It was the Algonquins that referred to them as the Mohawk, and Mohawk literally means eaters of human flesh. And what happened here was that during times of war, the Mohawks practiced ceremonial cannibalism, believing that if they partook in the valor of their enemies, they would partake in their strength. Nashua literally means where the river divides, and it's the term that the Nashua referred to themselves as the people that lived where the river divides. Watauga is kind of a fascinating place name. It comes really from 2 words, Witu, which has reference to wigwam, and these were the dome-shaped dwelling places that Native Americans built out of bark shingles, and Auk, which means place or ground. So if we were really using the Native American pronunciation before it got anglicized, it would be Watauga. And literally what it means is the wigwam place, or the ground that looks like a wigwam. You can see Watauga on a clear day looming up on the horizon, and it looks exactly like a wigwam. It has that dome, rounded shape. Another large hill we think of as Wachusett. Aku in the Algonquin means high, and "ok" again means place, so it has reference to the high place or the high ground. And when you think about how Wachusett just sort of looms up out of the plain around it and is the highest hill in the area, it was a very prominent feature that Native Americans would have recognized and noted. And so hence it literally means high ground or high places. Assumption is that the native culture in New England is no more, and that's totally not the case. I mean, when we think of the state of Maine, we've got the Penobscot, we've got the Passamaquoddy that reside in Maine. When we think of areas of Vermont, we have the Western Abenaki. Here in Massachusetts, we have the Nipmuc Nation, we have the Wampanoag people, the Mashpee on the Cape, the Narragansett in Rhode Island, the Pequot and Mohegan in Connecticut. And then there are tribes that have left New England, such as the Mohican, that have relocated out in states like Wisconsin, but they still have connections with the Berkshires and Western Connecticut, their original homeland, before they were displaced. So this is an ongoing community that's still with us in New England, despite tragic history that occurred for many of them in the New England region.
I'm Ann O'Connor, and I was Ann O'Connor even before I started this show. But I'm here with Stephen F. Johnson, or Steve Johnson, who is an expert historian on Indian culture here in New England, basically from the pre-contact period on. Yep. And Steve, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, what you do, what your degrees are?
Sure. I teach high school American history, and I have my bachelor's degree in history, my master's in education, and I did quite a bit of research on Native American history back in the 80s and 90s, and eventually produced Ninawac, the Algonquian people of New England. I currently teach at Marlborough High School.
Very nice. I'd like to show everybody the cover of your book. This was really quite an undertaking. How long did you spend researching and writing this?
Approximately 10 years, about 10 years.
As part of the process of finding out about Native Americans in our area, and found out really that there wasn't too much here. There was everything has, not everything, but the great majority of things were made of natural materials, and because of our acidic soil, they're gone, they're dissolved.
This is true. Most of what archaeologists find, obviously bone fragments, potsherd from ceramics, and stone artifacts, primarily what's unearthed in New England.
Okay. What they've been doing, which I find really exciting out at Fruitlands, is something called experiential archaeology. So they are building a longhouse using techniques and tools and materials that would have been available when the natives were building it to find out just what it took to build something. And when they do this, which I found really exciting, was they find out why things are the way, or were the way they were. As part of their lifeways, the tribes in this area moved during the course of the year.
That's correct.
And so they had to have things that they could bring with them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They had a seasonal lifestyle, basically, and they moved with the season. So if we were to follow their cycle, in the spring, they would move towards the waterfalls, the major rivers, and they would basically take the migrating fish as they were moving upstream. Once the fishing season was over, as they approached the month of late May, June, they moved to their planting fields, and there they would remain throughout the summer. They'd raise corn, squash, beans, and other vegetables. And then as we moved to the end of the summer, they would harvest those crops. Most of the tribe would then move into the deeper wooded valleys as winter approached to take cover from the extreme weather. The younger people would go up country, hunt the larger game, return to that main winter camp for the rest of the winter, and in the spring they'd start the cycle all over again, returning to the falls for the fishing season. So they actually used all of the land that was their domain, but they used it seasonally, so not every single area was being used intensely all the time. which caused the English, when they came into the region, to have this ethnocentric view that the land was open for the taking because it wasn't, in their estimation, being used fully or properly. And as a result, there was basically this clash between the English and Native Americans over the use of the land and how it was used. Native Americans used the land in a very different way from the settled patterns of the English.
Nashua tribe used the Nashua River Valley, and there's a beautiful view of the Nashua River Valley from Fruitlands, the ridge that goes over that section of the river down what is now Lancaster and Bolton. I believe that there was a settlement that was close to there, perhaps in Sterling.
Yes, yeah. Washacum was the key village for the Nashua, and all the Native American tribes that lived in New England were really river people. In fact, the Penobscot, when you think of the Penobscot that are in Maine to this day, the very compass direction north in the Penobscot language literally means upriver. And that just shows just how important the river was to all the tribes. And when you think of all the major confederacies, the Penobscot, the Kennebec, they were on the rivers. The Pennacook were on the Merrimack. The Massachusetts on the Charles and Mystic rivers. And then as we go, the Narragansett around Narragansett Bay, the Pequot on the Chautauqua and Mystic rivers in eastern Connecticut. They really were a river people and utilized the rivers for transportation, for sources of food, resources, and so forth.
One thing I found interesting when I was talking to Mike Volmar, who's an archaeologist, was the Nashua River Valley, when the major ice age left, was covered by glacial lake. And over the course of thousands and thousands of years, 10,000 years, there were several different, what he called life ways, or ways of life, perhaps with new people coming in. But the way that the tribes had to adapt to changing climates and to the changing topography, because the land is now rivers and valleys and hills. And when it first started out, it was all a lake, which...
This is true, because when you go back to the archaeological history of New England, you can go back to about 11,000 years ago when you're talking about the Paleolithic hunters who were really pursuing large game, caribou. They were pursuing mastodons, the larger animals, using the Paleolithic points. And then as the ice retreated, we get into the early Archaic period where increasingly they're beginning to hunt for smaller game. And by the time we get into the Archaic period and the woodland period, the Native Americans are becoming more sedentary in the sense that they're still moving about seasonally, but they're taking much smaller game. And so the topography of the land's changing, the flora and fauna is changing with these different geological periods.
Maybe could you give us a little overview of what happened to the Nashua tribe?
Well, the Nashua probably began to make contact with the English by the time we reached the late 1630s, early 1640s. Mass Bay colonies established in 1630, so settlers beginning to push into the interior. By the time we get into the late 1630s, you have towns like Groton and Lancaster being founded by the 1650s. So certainly by that time, the Nashua are making a regular contact with English settlers in their region. They were even impacted by the missionary effort of Reverend John Eliot out of Roxbury, his attempt to bring the Christian faith to the Nashua. Of course, all of this was upset by King Philip's War. During that conflict, the Nashua were actually part of the Pennacook Confederacy, which was located in New Hampshire. But their lands were here in central Massachusetts. They were closely affiliated with the Nipmuc tribe that was in the same region. And the Nashua, when that war breaks out, most of the Pennacook pull northward to avoid the conflict. Wanalancet's the leader over in Pawtucket, where the city of Lowell is today. He makes a decision that the tribe isn't going to participate in King Philip's War. They retreat into New Hampshire. But the Nashua, their homeland is right here in central Massachusetts. They make a decision to join with the Nipmuc in King Philip's war effort. And of course, when that war is over, the English are the victors. The Nashua retreat to coastal New Hampshire, where the English eventually find them. They're returned to Boston. Some of them are hung on the gallows. Others are sold into slavery. So pretty much at the end of King Philip's War, the Nashua way of life is totally dislocated and the tribe is totally scattered at the end of the conflict.
Just a couple of questions, a couple of clarifications. When they were sold into slavery, where were they sold to?
A lot of times they were sent into the Caribbean, to Bermuda, to other places that were under the control of the English or other European powers.
Okay. Now, we know this as King Philip's War, but King Philip was not a European king.
Correct. That's a bit of confusion that often faces people. King Philip is the second son of Massasoit. Massasoit is the leader, the Wampanoag leader, or sachem of the Wampanoag nation, and Philip was his second son. His original name, his Native American name, is Metacomet, but the English conferred on him that name Philip. Philip's older brother was Wamsutta, who the English referred to as Alexander.
Okay, thank you. Because another thing you thought maybe we should touch more on is we all think that the English arrived here in 1620 in Plymouth, and that was like, wow, you know, Indians had not seen a European before. But that's not the truth, is it?
No, it's not. We have almost 100 years of contact that's going on prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims in 1620. We can go back all the way to the 1520s. We've got Giovanni de Verrazzano sailing for the French off the coast of North America. He comes as far north as Block Island, Cape Cod, eventually arrives in southern Maine before returning to France. He makes contact with the Narragansett. He makes contact with the Abenaki in southern Maine. Then we have fishermen that are coming down basically from the Maritimes along the New England coast, all during the 1500s. And then we have Martin Pring that comes in the early 1600s sailing for the English. Bartholomew Gosnold comes shortly after that. We have French explorers off the coast. We have Sieur de Mons. Samuel de Champlain is here during that first decade of the 1600s. Captain Durham is responsible for returning Squanto, who had actually been in England prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims, because he had been taken captive by Captain Hunt in 1614, eventually brought over to England, and then returned. And then the Pilgrims arrived in 1620. So the Pilgrims, the Native Americans were very familiar with the various European groups that were off the coast. In fact, some of the English report that the Penobscot, for instance, and the other Abenaki tribes were actually using French and English words interchangeably with their Native American words when dealing with the French and English off their coasts.
Wow, now Squanto was the Indian who's attributed to helping the Pilgrims settle in.
Yeah, without Squanto, the Pilgrims may very well not have survived.
Okay, so
and his is a fascinating story. What happened here is Captain Smith of Virginia fame is off the New England coast in 1614. He's mapping the coastline. He sends Captain Hunt to trade with the Native Americans. Captain Hunt goes off the coast of Cape Cod, and he starts trading with the Nausetts that live in that area. Squanto happened to be out there at that time, and Captain Hunt managed to encourage a number of the Native Americans to come on board. They were wrestled to the ground, put in the hull of the ship, and it was part of the cargo that was brought over to Europe to be sold. And we don't know very much about where Squanto exactly landed. We know that somehow he eventually ended up in England. And there he came to the attention of Sir Fernando Georges, and Sir Fernando Georges was interested in establishing a colony in New England. So he wanted to know more about the flora and the fauna. So he attempted to teach the language, the English language, to Squanto so they could get that information firsthand. By 1619, Georges has decided he's gotten the information he needs, and he puts Squanto on board Captain Durham's ship, and Squanto returns to New England just a year prior to the arrival of the Pilgrims, so that when the Pilgrims land and finally establish themselves at Plymouth, they're at first stunned that Squanto has proficiency with English. He's clearly familiar with where they came from, and they have no doubt that Squanto has been in England, which was a real benefit to them, because he really is responsible for helping the Pilgrims to survive those first few years. He is literally their ambassador to the Wampanoag world.
Talking about maybe the difference between the English and the French settlement, you mentioned a lot of different types of Dutch people, French people, Italian names, English names. Why are we English? Why is Canada French?
Well, we can roll it back to basically the early 1600s. The major European powers that were facing the Atlantic in Europe, the English, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, the Portuguese, were all eyeing the potential of colonizing the North and South American coast. And the end result here is that in 1607, the English have their first successful colony at Virginia. The French have their first successful colony in the northern part of North America in 1608 at Quebec. And the style of settlement was very different between the two societies. The English came as colonists to stay, to build towns, to bring their families, to literally import the English way of life into North America. The French came more with the intention of accessing the resources, the trade, interacting with the Native Americans. The French population always remained small. It was less intrusive on the Native American world compared to the impact that the English settlement was having further south here in New England and even further south in Virginia.
Okay. Now, this is a question that really has to do with all of the Europeans and all of the Native Americans here, and that is, why is it that smallpox decimated the Indian population but not European?
That's a very good question. The reason is that Native Americans, in their isolation from the other major population centers in Asia, in Europe, and elsewhere, had not been exposed to smallpox, measles, influenzas that were common in Europe. So when the Europeans arrive, they literally brought those viral infections with them. And because the Native Americans had no immunities to them, there are estimates that as much as 90% of the population was wiped out by disease before the Pilgrims and the Puritans actually landed in 1620 and 1630. So very well may be that when the Puritans and Pilgrims landed, they were seeing roughly anywhere between 10 to 20% of what the population had been prior to 1614.
Now, what did the Pilgrims find when they marched into Plymouth to set up their plantation?
When they arrived there, they discovered a land, a ground that obviously had been inhabited. It was clear that there had been Native Americans using the land. The tribe that had been there was the Patuxets. And what had happened to the Patuxets, most of them had been wiped out in the smallpox epidemic of 1617. Squanto was actually one of the surviving members of the Patuxet tribe because he had been in England during the epidemic. So literally, sometimes we think of the Pilgrims inheriting this howling, untamed wilderness. In actuality, they didn't. What they inhabited was a land that had been occupied for generations by Native Americans, land that was in use. Many of them talked about large areas of land that had been cleared for farming that was now available to them because large numbers of the Native American population had been wiped out due to the smallpox epidemic.
Okay. Now, we have a question from Lisa Heldka, who's written a lot about food, and she wants to know, can you tell from the historical evidence very much about the diet of the native peoples of the region? What can you tell us that goes beyond the stories we learned in elementary school?
Well, we know obviously that corn was a major part of their diet, as was the various squashes, pumpkins. They clearly ate the foods that were natural, growing wild. Acorns, chestnuts, and other types of berries and nuts that were available on the forest floor. Okay. They took the fish from the streams. They had a very varied diet because they were accessing not only what they grew, but also what they were accessing directly from the wild. Native Americans in southern New England were far more dependent on agriculture than the tribes further north. So when you talk about the Abnaki, the Pennacook, the Western Abnaki, they're more of a hunting culture. They're more of a gathering culture as far as acquiring the foodstuffs. When you come further south here in southern New England, there's a greater dependency on agriculture, coupled with hunting and gathering.
Okay, so as a more, because they have a greater dependence on agriculture, would they be a more settled people, more likely to have larger objects that they can't take from place to place?
Certainly larger groupings. The Abenaki and tribes further north moved in smaller family groups and probably didn't have the larger centers of collection that may have occurred during the height of the agricultural season in southern New England. So in that respect, it might have been different, yeah.
Okay. Now, one thing we haven't talked too much about are the wars that, so far we've already had 90 to 95% of the Native Americans wiped out before Europeans even got here to finish it off. But I'd like to hit, we have a few minutes, a little bit about John Fitch, because you did talk about him. And I just think it's interesting, you know, for people to know what he had to do with Native Americans.
True. If we look at the series of conflicts that occurred in New England relative to the Algonquin people, the earliest one is the Pequot War in 1636. And this is really a conflict that involves Connecticut Colony, Mass Bay Colony, and the Pequot. And of course, this is a sad chapter in the early colonial history. The Pequot are defeated in this war. At least 600 of the Pequot tribesmen are massacred basically at Mystic Fort. And when the war's over, the English forced the Pequots to the Treaty of Hartford, which in many ways was cultural genocide because it demanded that the Pequot no longer live on their soil. They were to take up residence with neighboring tribes, the Narragansett, the Niantic, and the Mohegan. And they were no longer to use their name. And they were not to return to their land. So in that sense, the English literally attempted to bring on a cultural genocide of the Pequot people. The next conflict that occurs is King Philip's War, where Philip basically comes to the conclusion that his father's attempt to coexist with the English is not working. The Wampanoags find themselves on smaller and smaller parcels of land. The influx of English settlers, the influence of Christian missions on the tribe eventually ignites a conflict. And of course, at the end of King Philip's War, the Wampanoag are defeated, and large numbers of tribes are dislocated by that conflict. Then things settle down until about 1689, when we get the French and Indian conflict. And this is an off and on again conflict that starts with King William's War, which ends in 1697. Then Queen Anne's War that ends roughly around 1713. And then we come to King George's War, and that's where John Fitch comes into the picture. In King George's War, what we've got going on is that Native Americans are coming down from the north, out of Canada, and attacking the New England frontier towns. And as they're attacking the New England frontier towns, English are being taken captive, brought back to Canada, and in order for these people to be returned, they have to be ransomed by their families back here in New England. And of course, John Fitch was one of those individuals that suffered attack in the 1740s during King George's War. He was taken captive to Canada, and then eventually he and his children were returned. As you know, his wife didn't survive the journey back to New England.
Right now we have another question that came in, which is how old are the carvings you showed in Bellows Falls? And they're called petroglyphs. And that was like it's been a thing in my entire life to look for those petroglyphs. I finally found them this summer, and they're about 200 or 300 feet away, and they kind of look like a cross between, I don't know, smiley faces and E.T. Archaeologists estimate they're about 2,000 years old. They're in the bed of the river. They don't really know anything about them or why they're there. They were carved deeper by somebody trying to preserve them a while ago, and that big strip of yellow paint that you see there was so people can see them.